All right, well, thank you to everyone for joining us for another of our shark webinar series. And I'm really excited to be hosting this one because Dr. Andrew Chin has some amazing stories, is doing some really interesting research with a lot of different species, which I think is exciting. He is a fisheries and sharks scientist at James Cook University in Australia. Pretty amazing. I think I have an awesome backyard in Bimini in the Bahamas, but having the Great Barrier Reef in your backyard, not too shabby. Also sounds pretty amazing. So, and tagging tiger sharks, hammerheads, sawfish, really diverse research. So really excited to hear a little bit more about that. Yeah, so thank you again to everybody who is joining us. Again, put those questions in the Q&A and we'll do our very best to get to as many as possible. And I'm gonna go ahead and let our special guest, Dr. Andrew Chin, take over. Thank you so much.
Right, you guys can hear me all right?
Audio's great.
All right, fantastic. Hey, thanks everyone for coming along. I assume that the bulk of you will be somewhere in the United States where it's nighttime, evening time. Everyone's just had dinner or something, depending on where you are. So it's morning here and I'm still getting the system started. So hence the unending coffee. But thanks everyone for coming along. Super excited to be talking to you guys today about the sharks in our backyard, which is the Great Barrier Reef, and also the South Pacific and Southeast Asia. So I'll just start sharing the screen here. And all right, so just like I said, today we're going to be talking about the sharks of the South Pacific and the Great Barrier Reef, which I've called the Tales from the South. Now, just before we begin, it's something that we do in Australia. We acknowledge the traditional owners of the land and sea country that we work and live on. In my case, it means acknowledging the Wulguru, Kabar, and the Bindal people, who are the people of the local country here. I pay my respects to their ancestors past, present, and emerging. And as a scientist, I also acknowledge the role of first Australians and Indigenous peoples as the innovators, first scientists, and the custodians in the wise use of land and sea country. So as Gillian said, yeah, I'm a shark biologist and fisheries scientist working at James Cook University in the Great Barrier Reef, which is not a bad place to be. Now, when I tell people what my job is, this is what people think I do all day, and certainly that is the fun stuff, but reality looks a lot more like this. So for those of you thinking, who are interested in shark science and becoming marine biologists, you can never escape the paperwork. So this is just a week of my life in March last year. And if you have a look down all of these tabs here, all of this was paperwork and people. Where it comes to shark stuff, didn't see a live shark, didn't tag one, didn't see a dead one, didn't touch one, didn't get near one, did not go diving, did not get in the ocean, did not get near the ocean, but I saw the ocean that week. And that is fairly typical for the life of a marine biologist. So yes, there are upsides, but there's also the reality. Okay, so just situating everyone. All right, so this is an orthograph map. This is the most realistic representation of the size of countries and the size of oceans. All right, so here we are here. This is the world. You guys are over here somewhere with NFL cowboy hats, good steaks and raccoons. Just so you know, I love raccoons. Raccoons are awesome. We're down here. We've got rugby. We also have cowboy hats. Our steaks are better. And we've got killer jellyfish. All right, so we'll talk about sharks and rays in my backyard down here. But we're also going to be talking about some other places. So just to put everyone in the same frame, we're going to be talking a little bit about Singapore, which is actually where I was born and grew up. We'll talk about Papua New Guinea, the South Pacific. We'll talk about Indonesia, and we'll talk about the Solomon Islands as well, which again is also in the South Pacific. Singapore and Indonesia are in Southeast Asia, which is these block of countries in here. Okay, so first off, we're going to talk about my backyard, the Great Barrier Reef. Okay, so the Great Barrier Reef is pretty massive. It's the world's largest barrier reef, 2,900 reefs and islands, 2,900 reefs, sorry, about 900 islands, just under 350,000 square kilometers. It's about 132,000 square miles. It's the equivalent of 17 million football fields. So it's about the size of Italy or the size of Germany or Japan. Now, only 7% of the Great Barrier Reef is coral reefs. The other 90-odd% is other types of habitats. Okay, but we talk a lot about coral reefs because they're pretty. The reefs on the Great Barrier Reef got 650 coral species, but throughout the whole area, so it's non-coral habitats as well, we've got about 1,600 fish. We've got dugongs, whales, and topic of today, we've got 135 species of sharks and rays. So here's just a smattering of photos from a friend of mine, Takuma, who's a master reef guide up in Cairns, which is one of our diving hotspots. And this is just from his Instagram page. You can see we've got a lot of life, a lot of different animals, and beautiful coral growth out here. And sharks are one of the main attractions. So we've got something called the Great Eight. It's like Africa's Big Five. It's the reef's Great Eight. And sharks like whale sharks, leopard sharks, and any sharks are big draw cards for tourism. And when you talk about Great Barrier Reef and what you see on the tourism brochures, this is what you think of, right? Pretty clear water. It's all very nice. That's my Great Barrier Reef. That is an actual real underwater shot from one of my study sites. I work in the coastal waters of the Great Barrier Reef. Beautiful habitats, really diverse, but nice and exciting when you're working in these sorts of environments because you never know what's just around the corner. And one thing we do have to worry about is crocodiles when we're doing our field work. And also some really, really interesting questions in these places. So here's a whole bunch of black-tip reef sharks, swimming around in coastal mangroves. So what are they doing there? I mean, as a scientist, this is an interesting question, and we'll touch back in that. We'll circle back to that in a moment. Now, when you're talking about sharks on the Great Barrier Reef, people like the big stuff. We like, we've got whale sharks, hammerheads, and this is actually taken from Bimini. Tiger sharks and mantas, and again, some photos from a friend of mine, Alex Kidd, who's an amazing photographer out in Western Australia. And the big stuff is cool. I don't know how many of you watched my buddy Dean Grubbs when he gave his talk a few weeks ago on this channel. He said that big stuff is boring, and I have to tend to agree. So this is Dean saying that the typical shark people think of as the great white shark. He also said he'll never call it that. He thinks they're the so-so shark. And yeah, I agree. Because there are so many more interesting species for me out here. Like I said, I work in the coasts, and there's so many different types of coastal habitats. You've got mudflats, you've got seagrass, beds and rocky reefs, inshore coral reefs, you've got mangroves, and all this diversity of habitats means that we have this amazing diversity of sharks that have all adapted to different ecological niches in those habitats. And these sharks all have different forms, right? They've evolved different body shapes and different, I guess, biological engineering so that they can live successfully in all these different habitats. And, if you have a look, we've got different body shapes here. We've got different tail shapes. These broad, long tail shapes are not very fast, but they're really maneuverable, which is good if you're trying to get in and amongst rocks. So we've got a lot of diversity in the coast. And one of the things we do here is we go around to schools with something we call the sharkophagus, which is basically a big esky, or what you guys will call a cooler, filled with sharks. And we show the kids what we have in our backyard. And I guarantee those school kids that they have swim these animals have swum past them at the beach and they would have never known. And these are sharks no one has ever heard of except for shark biologists. This is what you won't see on Shark Week. Out here, we've got weasel sharks, which is this really interesting animal with these widely dispersed dorsal fins. We've got the Australian sharp-nosed shark. That animal is fully grown. That is as big as it gets. It only grows to about 70, 80 centimeters long. It grows very, very quickly. It's one of the sharks we could actually fish for food sustainably. We've got a really cool shark called the black spot shark. Not a very exciting name. It's a black spot shark because it's got a black spot on it, but a really, really cool small whaler shark we have in the coastal waters. One of my favorite sharks is this guy here. This is the creek whaler, Cacarinus fitzroyensis. Only grows to about maybe 4 foot, but really cool animal. It's a seagrass specialist. It eats fish. We think it's called a creek whaler because we think it actually goes up estuarine creeks as well. So a really interesting, I have to say, really pretty shark that we don't know much about. Now here we go back to those black-tip reef sharks in mangroves. So one of the bits of research we did was try and figure out what these sharks are doing there. So what we have is in Cleveland Bay, which is this bay here, we had an array of all of these sort of data loggers, these receivers. And we tagged these sharks with internal tags that broadcast a unique identification mark, like a social security number. Every time the shark was in range of one of these receivers, the receiver would record it. This shark was here at this date and time. So we had these pingers in, we tagged sharks for up to 3 years, and this is what we found. We found what's called stock structuring. So the population of black-tip reef sharks was mainly females and all babies and teenagers, okay? Very, very few adult males. So, and all of these animals all hung out in this area of Cockle Bay, quite a small area. And that's the only place they seem to use. So they're very, very tightly tied to this one area. And what we found over time is that the adult females are permanent residents. They stay there, they reproduce, they make more young babies. The baby sharks are born and they grew up here for a little while, say for a couple of years until in shark terms they're like teenagers, and then they disappear. And what we found is that these animals are actually like backpackers. So they grow up here, and then once they're large enough into their teenage years, they leave home and they start exploring the world. And we found that some of these sharks were ending up to 80 kilometers away on coral reef. So here we've got a really, really good example of coastal sort of mangrove and mudflat habitat supporting a reef shark population up to 80 kilometers away offshore. So you know, mangroves and mudflats are really, really important for shark conservation and sustaining populations as well. And then we've got more of these really cool critters. So here we've got another weasel shark. Here we've got an epaulet shark. So these guys are amazing. They live in these really, really shallow reef flats that at heights, at low tide, the reef flat basically drains. All the water heats up. And you know, as you know from basic physics, hot water can't hold as much oxygen. So these guys have actually got special physiology in their brain. They can shut down parts of their brain so they can still function on an incredibly low oxygen environment. And you can actually see these guys. Sometimes they're called walking sharks because they'll actually use their pectoral fins and they'll walk around on the reef flat, actually coming out of the water to go in between pools to find their prey, which is little crabs, snails, and worms and stuff. So, you know, a really interesting species and physiologically much more interesting than a white shark. Over here, we've got the slit-eye shark, Loxodon macrinus, and then here we've got sawfish. Sawfish are really, really amazing animals. This is an image by a friend of mine, Dr. David Wackenfeld. It's taken in very clear water, but sawfish, a lot of them live in very, very muddy habitats where you can't really see. So what these things have is they've got those electrosensors, those ampullae of Lorenzini. They're really, really densely packed around the front of the sawfish, and they've got this massive saw. So they can feel when, or they can sense when a big school of mullets or some prey fish is coming close that they can't really see. They then lift this massive saw up and they slash it through the water, and then that injures or stuns or kills the fish, and then they can, in the zero visibility water, go and pick it up using their special sensors. So that's very, very cool. And these guys can grow up to 7 meters. So that's what, over 20 foot. So massive, massive critters. They are incredibly tough. Crocodiles are tougher. This is some research done by David Morgan at Murdoch University in Western Australia. And sawfish, like this large-toothed sawfish here, when they drop their pups, the pups go upriver into fresh water to grow up there where it's relatively free, well, less densely packed with predators, but they still get taken out by crocodiles and bull sharks. And David showed that up to 50% of the juvenile sawfish showed attack scars from crocodiles or bull sharks. So, life in the coastal zone can be pretty tough. All right, so sawfish aren't actually sharks. They're what we call batoids or rays. And there's a whole range of other shark-like batoids we have. So things like this animal here, the shark ray, that we know almost nothing about. I mean, when you see these guys, they're actually this prehistoric Jurassic Park looking thing. Amazing animals, but we know almost nothing about them. And then we've got all the rays as well in the coastal zone. Really interesting and beautiful animals like this ornate eagle ray, which is the biggest of the eagle ray species. Again, we know almost nothing about them. We've actually got a citizen science project at the moment trying to gather sightings of these things so we can try and figure out their distribution a bit better. But, amazing species that we know almost nothing about. And then we've got all these other beautiful rays. Here we've got an Australian whip ray, cowtail ray, one of my favorites, the porcupine ray. So called because it's got these thorny spikes all over it. Porcupine rays are seriously chunky animals. They're very, very cool. So right next door to Australia, we've got Papua New Guinea, and so much diversity in Papua New Guinea. So I was lucky enough to be involved in a project working with Dr. Will White here at CSIRO, and we were helping Papua New Guinea fisheries do some sort of basic biology on some of the animals that were taken in their fisheries. So here we are going through the Kanudi fish collection at the University of Papua New Guinea. And these fish collections are incredibly important because they hold the knowledge about what sharks and rays are in each area. And when we were there, Will pulled out a jar and he put this thing down and said, "Here, have a look at this." And I'm having a look at this and I'm like, "I've never seen or heard anything like this." And he's like, "Well, there's only 2 specimens known in existence, and this is one of them." So what we have here, this is 50% of the global knowledge about this species in this one specimen, the Golgol river shark, Golgolia falwoodii. So amazing. This animal could still be around out there in Papua New Guinea, but no one's gone to look. So we just don't know, something we just don't know about. Papua New Guinea is full of surprises. So here we have the first ever adult photo of an adult glyphis or river shark. So these things will actually live up in the rivers, and they're critically endangered throughout the world. And no one had seen river sharks in Papua New Guinea in a long, long time. Through this project, Will and an ex-student of mine, John Smart, went up there, and Will saw these jaws in a village. And he's like, "Hold on, that looks like glyphis." So they left the camera with the village headman, and they said, "If you catch any more, please, take photos." And this is the photo they took. And lo and behold, it's an adult river shark. So these rivers up in Papua New Guinea can be lifeboats for some of the most threatened and endangered sharks we have out there. And one of my students now, Michael Grant at James Cook University, he's now doing a project up in Papua New Guinea looking at some of these river sharks and sawfishes as well. And this is one of the cases, the more we look, the more we find. And, Will is a taxonomist, and, his job is to try and figure out which species are which. And there's a lot of stuff we still haven't discovered yet. So it was only in 2016 that we figured out, looking at specimens from across Northern Australia, Indonesia, and Solomon Islands, that this one species, Neotrigon coolii, which we always thought was one species, was actually different. And what we actually have now is 3 new species from the Indo-West Pacific. So these species, we all thought there were one species, are actually 4. So, you know, here's an example. What we all call Neotrigon coolii, or the Cool's masquerade, only is in Solomon Islands. And for us in Australia and in New Caledonia over here, it's the coral sea masquerade. It's not what we thought it was. And it's only when people start looking properly that we find out that there's always more to find. And you know what? We found the same thing with lagoon rays. So we all thought that this blue-spotted lagoon ray was one species. Turns out there's another 3 hidden species. And there's lots of different types of knowledge as well. So I work with Aboriginal rangers up in a place called Cape York, and they've got some amazing knowledge. One example here is stingrays that don't occur on the east coast of Australia, according to science. And they were describing this ray to me. I'm like, that sounds like this ray. And they're like, yeah, okay, maybe. And I'm like, well, that would be really cool if it was, because they're not supposed to occur here. Can we go, you know, next time take a photo? And the guy was like, well, do you want to go and see it now? I'm like, yeah. So he just jumped in, went to the river, and just, there it is. I'm looking at this thing going, holy crap. Now, this is a project that another student, Karen Gerhardt, is working on. And we're still waiting for permission from the elders and stuff to share their knowledge, because their traditional knowledge is very important. But hopefully that, when that comes out, that'll be a really neat find. But we've got a whole bunch of really crazy stuff happening in the Pacific. So here's the Kavachi volcano in the Solomon Islands. National Geographic went down there and they put these deep cameras in, and they found these animals swimming around in the hot acidic water. What are they doing there? Nobody knows. So one of the things we're trying to do is something called the Shark Search Indo-Pacific program. So we're trying to figure out what sharks and rays are in each country and what are their values and the threats. So we can use that as a basis for further management and conservation. So essentially what it means is we get someone on board to start doing data mining. They use all of these references and they try and build up a list of what sharks and rays are in each country. And for example, on the website, we've got a page for each country. This is the Solomon Islands. This was done by Sarah Hilton. And one of the most important things we have is we work with local people. So here you can see all the in-country partners that are involved in that Solomon Islands project. And what we came out with the Solomon Islands is, well, we found 50 shark and ray species, about 32 sharks, 18 rays. Like I said, this is all done by Sarah, who is now working for the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission over your side of the pond. One of the interesting things we found was a record of this. Someone sent us in a photo of a sawfish rostrum. And you can identify quite accurately the species from the sawfish rostrum. And this showed that this showed that dwarf sawfish actually occur in the Solomon Islands. So that pushed the global range out to the Solomon Islands. So we knew that this list is a starting point and that numbers will change as more and more science is done. We also had a look at some of the cultural values of these things, which is pretty amazing. And in the Pacific, cultural values of sharks and rays are some beautiful and really fascinating knowledge. So in the Solomon Islands, Sarah's project found records of shark priests where they would actually feed the sharks and they would attract the sharks into the shallow lagoons, and apparently the sharks would turn upside down and the priests would just scratch their bellies like puppy dogs. In the Cook Islands, we've got the legend of Ina and Tinarau. So it's actually depicted on their $3 bill. Basically, Ina and Tinarau were lovers, and Tinarau spent a lot of time out at sea, and Ina really missed him, so she wanted to get out to go and find him, and a shark, she called the shark, or a shark came by, and it actually took her out. So she grabbed some coconuts for water and food, jumped on the back of the shark, and the shark took her out to go and find Tinarau. Now, one version of the legend says that on the way, Ina needed something to break the coconuts open, so she used the shark's head and she bashed the head, and that's how the hammerhead was created. It was a shark, but because Eva kept smacking it on the head with coconuts, the head became flat and it became a hammerhead. In Hawaii, we've got Kamoho Alihi, which is a shark god, and some telling of that myth says that he would go out, he could be called in and go out to rescue lost sailors or fishermen who had been lost at sea. In Fiji, we've got the shark god Dakawanga, and a friend of mine who works in Fiji told me you never say his name while you're actually on the water at sea, because that's incredibly bad luck. He actually did that once and he never did it again. Interesting that in these cultural tellings, sharks aren't these mindless killers out to kill people. They are messengers or helpers, but they also bring justice. So if you've done something wrong, you will run into problems with sharks. In New Britain, in Papua New Guinea, we've got shark callers. So here we've got coconut rattles that they'll use to actually move up and down through the water, and they'll actually attract sharks. And they actually do this to catch them. And in Torres Strait, a lot of knowledge is encapsulated in art. Here we have a lithograph by Billy Missy, and this shows the changing of the season, the arrival of the Torres Strait pigeon, arrival of turtles and dugongs at certain times, hammerheads coming at certain times of the year to hunt stingrays. So a lot of their traditional knowledge can be caught up in this artwork. All right, now in modern times, we've got cameras, and cameras can be really important. So remember how I said with the Solomon Islands list, things will change? 2 months after we published that in a scientific paper, we got this photo from Andrew Short and Billy Kiki cruisers in Solomon Islands saying, we think this is a different ray, can you identify for us? Turns out they'd taken photos of Kuhl's devil ray, Mobula coolii. So the list was only up to date for 2 months, and it's already out of date now. And so we've now added this animal to the checklist. So the point here is that divers can have really, really important contributions to science. So we are also throughout the region encouraging divers to get in touch with us and send us photos of sharks and rays, because you never know what we're going to find. And in fact, this kind of citizen science can be really important. So there's a site out there called iNaturalist, which is an international site anyone can join. You can put any animal up there, plants, bugs, as long as it's something natural. You know, you can't put up a photo of your cat, right? And that's just a lot about logging the biodiversity of the world. And we use this to figure out what's where. And in Shark Search in the Pacific, we're doing this as well. So this is Singapore, where I grew up. It's an amazing place to visit. Big city life, all urban, very little natural environment left around it, but there are still sharks there. And here are my colleagues, Neil, Dr. Neil Hutchinson at James Cook University, Singapore, and our student May. And we're putting together the checklist for the sharks and rays of Singapore. So here we've got a nice little banded cat shark that, man, there are still sharks around Singapore. And if you jump onto iNaturalist, you start finding some cool records. So here's a nice blue spotted lagoon ray, just to the south of Singapore here. And then here we've got this river stingray, Pomatotrigon motoro, which is out in the middle here. And what? That's the ocellated freshwater stingray, which is endemic to South America. Like, it does not occur in Singapore. But I know people are taking photos of this thing in a reservoir in Singapore. And what we think is that these are aquarium escapees, okay? We've now got a population of Pomatotrigon motoro swimming around in a reservoir in Singapore. It's crazy. But we know that now because people took photos and logged it. So that is a really interesting story to come out from that checklist. Now, that came from an aquarium. So, you know, the aquarium trade in sharks and rays is, you know, one way we use them. Another way we use them as food, and we eat them everywhere. Like, sharks are eaten in Europe, in the US, Australia, everywhere. But in Southeast Asia, they're eaten as well, but in big numbers. And Indonesia is the world's largest shark fishery, and that's just off our yard here, and you know, sharks will be used. Yes, we've all heard about the fin trade. Sharks from Indonesia, a lot of fins come from Indonesia, also from India. But the meat is used as well, and it's affordable protein that people can use to survive. And what we have is, in Singapore at least, a lot of the sharks and a lot of the fish actually that come through Singapore actually come from Indonesia and Malaysia. And another student of ours, Brooke D'Alberto, she's been looking at what's been happening with wedge fishes in Australia. So these are, in Indonesia, sorry. So these are these animals here, the shark-like batoids. And there's very clear evidence from lots of data sources that wedge fish in Indonesia have absolutely declined. And what we think is happening is that catch is now being replaced by stingrays. And stingray meat is actually pretty good. You can use the skin for leather to make wallets and stuff as well. So this is something that we're looking at how to manage. So Brooke is looking at the conservation biology and the life history of all of these species, so we can figure out how best to manage them sustainably, but also to conserve the species that need conserving, like this thing here. So this is an amazing find. Again, this only came out last year. So this paper is from 2019. Another PhD student of mine who's based at James Cook University in Singapore, she's looking at conservation biology of sharks and rays in the Singaporean and Indonesian fisheries. She's been doing some market surveys, and she took these photos, and another collaborator of her took some photos as well. This is Christina Choi Pei. And she was like, hold on, that looks like Rhynchobatus cookii. That we haven't seen in 20 years, and people were saying is possibly, maybe, probably extinct. Hold on, we've got it right here, it's in front of me. So this is a really cool find. Now, all of these sharks and rays in these markets, they come from Indonesia or Malaysia. So somewhere in Indonesia or Malaysia, but probably Indonesia, this animal is still swimming around in the wild. It is not extinct. And hopefully, if we can get some funding, we'll actually start working with our local partners there, Wilderness Conservation Society, and see if we can get a project happening to find this thing, figure out what its major threats are, and figure out if we can conserve it. Hopefully it won't go extinct. And other major fisheries, another, oh, she's not a student, I guess she's a staff member, postdoc of ours, Shushmita. She's working, or will be working, she has been working, in Bengal, in India, where there are some massive shark fisheries. And she's just gotten another project funded to go back and do more work there, which is fantastic. But this is where science really needs to work. We need to figure out what's being caught. We need to figure out what the biology of these animals is, so that we can figure out ways to make sure that people can still eat and survive and make a living, but doing it sustainably so we aren't wiping out populations. Now, that's a massive challenge, but we need to start. And the basic information is what's being caught, how much is being caught, what are the trends in the catch, and how resilient or sensitive are each of these species to what's happening in fisheries. And there's a lot more to discover. This is a video that I took at a place called Heron Island 2 years ago. And I was like, I don't know what this eagle ray is. Like, it doesn't make sense. So I sent this video to my friend Will Weiss, who's the taxonomist, critical branch of science. And he's like, yeah, we've seen a few of these sort of photos before. We don't know what it is. Possibly / probably it's a new species. It's just undescribed. Get a sample if you can. So next time I go back, hopefully I will. But yeah, Heron Island is one of the most heavily visited tourism destinations on the Great Barrier Reef. Like, there's a research station on there. There's another research station next door to Heron Island. And there are still new species to be discovered. So, probably finish off now. What does this mean? I hope I've given you all the sense that there's still more to discover. There's more work to be done. We're still discovering new species in this area. There's some amazing places to visit. And the more we look, the more we find, the more we talk to people, and talking to people is incredibly important because, if you want to do work successfully in Fiji or the Solomon Islands, you need to touch base with the people who live there because they're the ones who know what's going on. So we got to work with those people. There are so many stories in the Indo-Pacific region. Some people revere sharks and would never touch them. For some people, sharks are, rice and school fees for their kid to get a better life, or medicine, right, for their wife. There is so many complicated relationships we have between communities, people, sharks, and culture here that as scientists is really fascinating and exciting. But it's also a bit scary because we got some big challenges. We've got poverty, we've got very intense population pressure, and people got to eat. And it's about trying to find a solution together to those really, really difficult problems so that people can still eat, but we can basically make sure species are managed sustainably. And for those species in real trouble, that we protect lifeboats like the river sharks in Papua New Guinea. Papua New Guinea could be a lifeboat for some of these species that have been almost wiped out in other places of the world. And again, all this comes down to working with the people who live there, because that's the only way long-term and effective conservation is going to get done. All right, that's pretty much it. Feel free to follow us on Instagram or Twitter. If you're interested in the Shark Search project, there's the website there. But if you just go to Google and search for Shark Search in the Pacific, it's all there. And yeah, thanks for hanging in there, guys.
Very cool. Well, thank you so much. A lot of really amazing information. And I think people have watched the sessions I've hosted, have heard me talking about, there's so much we just don't know. And there's new species. I mean, you highlighted that. And the species that are not newly discovered, there's still so much information about these individuals that we have no idea about. So for those kids
Absolutely.
watching, when you grow up, if you want to be a shark biologist, it's really exciting because there are new things to be discovered, always new questions. And I think the other take-home point that I really hope people see is communities working together. And that is so important for conservation. And a lot of times you don't see that. And it's really important that everybody involved, especially at the local level, you can see how much you guys are learning from them, the stories they have, the experiences. They're out there in the field every day.
Absolutely.
And so I think, it's really, really important for conservation of any species, land or in the ocean, is working with local communities. And oftentimes that gets overlooked. And it's one of the best assets that we have for conservation of any species. So very, very cool. All right, so we have a lot of great questions. We're going to start off with our first one that I like to ask people and has been asked in the question. What is your favorite shark?
All right, so
it's a tough one.
This is such a difficult question. All right, so the creek whaler for, that little 4-foot creek whaler shark. To be honest, I can't explain why I feel an affinity for that animal, but the creek whaler would be one of them. It's really interesting. The porcupine ray would be another one. So these are those big spiky rays. I mean, they get really, really big. And it's really interesting when you're going out looking for them and tagging them. It's almost like they're like linebackers, I guess. They are big, chunky, spiky animals, and they don't care if you're there or not. So when you see other stingrays feeding, like they can, especially the small ones, they'll be quite timid. They'll come in and they'll come out. You want to find a porcupine ray, you just look for this massive cloud of sand because they just burrow through it like bulldozers because they don't care, because they're these big armored things. And one of the funniest things I ever saw was a friend of mine, Dr. Pete Kine, basically we were trying to catch one and he had one in his hands and it was, almost half as big as him, and it took off with him on the back, like holding it, and he just disappeared off in this cloud. It was and good times, porcupine race. And I love/hate hammerhead sharks.
Hey now. Why is that?
They're really, really cool animals, but I spent 2.5 years trying to tag and track them, and they are, it's not like Bimini, Jillian. It's not like you just jump in and they're all there. You know, I'd spend, days and days at sea to get a glimpse of one, and they're elusive, difficult to find, difficult to tag. They rub their tags off, so they're amazing animals, but they're a real pain in the butt to work with, and I'd never do it again.
Yeah, I mean, they are. We're really lucky, obviously. And for those of you guys who watch, don't know what we're talking about, and Bimini has become world renowned for diving with great hammerheads. You can kind of see the photo there on that side. But yeah, when I had done work with them diving and trying to tag them at other locations before, I get you. It's a difficult species. They stress very easily. There's a lot of challenges when you're working with them, and sadly, they're a critically endangered species now, the great hammerhead. So this work is really important because, yeah, these animals are on the brink, like so many of these species. But in their case, there's a lot more known than some of these rarer species of sharks and rays. So Rosario said, sharks seem to be very smart. Are stingrays as intelligent? Because you've kind of worked with both. Have you looked at that? Or?
That's a really interesting question. I don't have hard data. I have my perception and opinion, and my opinion is yes. So for example, places where stingrays are attracted to a spot for tourism, the stingrays very quickly learn where and when things are going to happen, and how things are supposed to happen. So they can be trained just the way sharks can as well. I guess the other thing is that sharks. So stingrays really are just like a big meat pancake asking to be eaten, right? So if you were really, really dumb, you wouldn't have survived through evolutionary time. I think stingrays have got a bit going on. The fact that they're still here means that they're pretty smart. And there's this amazing thing, like there's this stingray called the pelagic stingray, right? It looks like just your regular stingray, but it lives out in the open ocean, like hundreds of meters deep. And in water hundreds of meters deep, like it's an open ocean thing. And the body design it's just not, it shouldn't be successful. Like, it doesn't make sense, but these things are out there eating squid. How does a round flat pancake manage to catch squid in the open ocean? Who knows? There got to be something going on.
Amazing too. And if people have ever visited an aquarium and seen sharks and rays, they swim to a target, they've learned, they've been taught that. And you're seeing sharks and rays do that. So they're definitely, as a whole, far more intelligent than I think a lot of people give them credit for.
Oh yeah.
So we've had a couple of people ask, including Campbell, why did you want to study sharks?
All right. Okay, so I grew up in Singapore, big city, but I don't know, there was something about the ocean that I always just found really captivating. Maybe it was because I grew up in a big city and I wanted space. I went to an island called Tioman when I was 13, which is an island in Malaysia. And I went snorkeling. We were there for a week. I went snorkeling. I saw my first coral reef, first clear water, and I was just blown away, mesmerized. And black-tip reef sharks swam by, and I was like, holy crap, that's amazing. And it's the first time I'd seen a live shark in the wild. And there was no fear. There was no, oh my God, it's a shark. It was just like the way it moved, and just the whole thing just was like, I was sucked in. I got hypothermia on that trip. Yes, it's the tropics, but if you spend enough time in the cold water, you can get hypothermia, which happened to me. But that's just because they couldn't get me out of the water. Amazing. And ever since then, like since I was 13, I was like, yeah, all right, it's got to be fish. If it's sharks, that's even better. But I got to be in the water, and I got to do fish. So that was it.
Yeah, I think it's amazing how so many people, I know a lot. I mean, I was lucky. I grew up going to the ocean, but I have so many friends that didn't grow up near the water, weren't necessarily, but had this moment. And a lot of them were
Mm.
young. I know for me, I swam a nurse shark snorkeling when I was 8, and it was just, yeah, life changing. This is the coolest thing ever. And so for you guys out there, if you go snorkeling, you visit an aquarium, you are out with your family, you see these things, think about that. Like, you can have these moments, and if you decide at a young age, you can follow through with that. So it doesn't have to go away and go, oh, well, I'm young. It might change, but it doesn't have to. And I think a lot of people, if you talk to marine biologists, it's been since they were pretty young, they had something cool happen and they followed that dream and they made it a reality. So very, very cool. All right. So do you have a most interesting, somebody asked, the most interesting shark to study, or I guess the most interesting shark that you've studied? Sounds like you've had a lot of really cool ones.
Most interesting shark to study. I'd love to know more about the porcupine ray. I'd have to say, again, it's another species we don't know very much about. Love to know more about the porcupine ray. I'd love to figure out the pelagic stingray. Like, how does this thing, which is a meat pancake, survive in the pelagic environment? I'd love to work on those animals. There are some small little cat sharks, which are really fascinating animals as well. But yeah, if someone dumped a bucket of money on me right now and just went, hey, go and research whatever little species you want, it'd probably be the porcupine ray.
Very cool. Along that line, somebody else asked, what is the most difficult part of studying sharks? You obviously mentioned kind of not being able to find them with the hammerheads, but is there something else that is challenging, or you think is the most challenging for studying these animals?
Yeah, all right. So it's an adult answer. The first one's funding. Getting funding together, getting the crew together so you can pay the crew and pay for the boats and everything to go out. And like, without the funding, it's just not going to happen. Other than that, it's, yeah, finding animals, especially if you're doing stuff where you're tagging or tracking animals, finding live animals. You know, every day that you're out there, you're spending time, you're spending money. Being able to get the animals that you need to quickly is really important. And, you know, if you're working on a project that's about conservation or stuff, working with people can be really, really challenging. People are people everywhere, and working with people can be really, really tough. Not tough. It just takes a lot of time. And you got to keep coming back, and you have to be willing sometimes, if you're doing like real hands dirty conservation with communities, you have to be willing to be yelled at for no reason or fault of your own. You wear the sins and blame of everything that's gone on, like, which has got nothing to do with you. That can be challenging, but you know, that's hard as well. But super rewarding when it comes together. Super rewarding, you know. And it's kind of this thing. It's like, the more challenging it is. If it was easy, everyone would do it, right?
And I, you know, people have heard me mention this, is we see on social media and pretty photos and tagging a shark, and what people don't see is those lists that you talk about and the amount of computer time. And there's a lot, and I think every marine biologist and probably every scientist that's working with animals, is people don't see the logistics, the time, the boats, the funding, all of the months of preparation that went into actually going out and finding those animals. And then, you know, you're working with a lot of very, very rare species. Living in the Bahamas, it's easy. I can say, I want to dive with a bull shark. Okay. Want to see a lemon shark. Okay. But we're very lucky. Most places, and in particularly rare species, months and months and months, and you may not find them, or we thought they. So I think that that's, you know, it's really important for people to understand is how much actual prep work and logistical work and like it goes into being able to share these cool stories and this information and these papers. There's a lot more that you don't see. And I hope that students and people in general that are watching these webinars are seeing that, because everyone is sharing sort of the time and energy and efforts that go into this. And for you in particular, because the rare species, it's magnified. It's even more so, which makes it even more rewarding, I would guess, because it's incredible.
Yeah. It could be worse. At least I'm not a deep sea shark scientist. I mean, trying to study those things, that's next level, man.
Yeah. A whole lot of more logistics and submarines and things like that. So definitely. All right. We had Nikki, who is watching from the UK, so it's very late there. Said they hear a lot about drum lines on the Great Barrier Reef, and are people and she wanted to know what's happening with that. Are attitudes changing? Are people support? I've seen I as well a lot of different back and forth, but we hear it from way across the other side of the world. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, okay. So for those of you who don't know, we have something called the Shark Control Program, which is basically the principle is that it's got big hooks on it, so it catches big sharks. Those sharks are killed, and then you reduce the number of big sharks. And if you reduce the number of big sharks around in an area, you reduce the risk of someone getting bitten. Now, scientifically, that logic doesn't really hold up. It's very difficult to prove. So it's a very, very controversial program. So conservation groups have been fighting drum lines for many years. Last year, or a couple of years ago, I think, they actually won a court battle. The drum lines were removed. But people who operate the drum lines are now looking to put them back in, but a different configuration. So basically looking at something called smart drum lines, which is when a shark gets hooked, the people get a text message immediately and they can go out, and if it's a non-threatening shark, they can release it. If it's a big shark like a tiger or something, they can tow it away and then release it. And they've done, like, that method has been done in South America. It's been trialed in New South Wales, which is the state to the south of us. And they've shown that once the animals are released, they don't come back for many, many months. So you're still getting the same effect of removing a shark from an area, but without killing it. So maybe this can be a happy middle ground. There are still areas that are outside of the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park that still have drumline gear in them. So for example, the beach that I go paddleboarding off, it's got drum lines in there. Do they keep people safer? That's a really difficult question to answer. And it's so difficult because so few people get bitten that it's impossible to run the statistics. But I've been working with communities again on this issue, and I can completely understand, because I can't, as a scientist, I can't put my hand on my heart and say, if we took that drum line out, you would be safe. You would be no more at risk than you were today, tomorrow. I can't say that. It's such a random event. It's less common than lightning. So yeah. So anyway, that's the situation. They're looking at changing the way they do it, and hopefully it's going to be better.
Yeah, it's tricky, and a lot of conservation issues. It's very gray. Like, there is no obvious solution, and that's one of the another really big challenge with conservation of species, because sometimes it's just there isn't an easy answer. But very interesting for sure. Jade asked, this is kind of going way back. You showed a little clip of the sharks, the deep sea cameras near the volcano.
Oh, yes.
Any ideas of why those sharks rays might have been in that area?
Yeah, okay, so there's lots of theories. One theory is that, how sharks can be attracted to deep frequency sound. A volcano erupting could just from a distance attract sharks in. Sharks might be curious. Now, why would an animal swim into hot, and not talking boiling, but we're talking hot, more acidic water? Some of the theories have said maybe they're getting in there to get rid of parasites, because sharks don't have hands, right? So you can't pick the parasites off you. That's probably the theory that would hold the most weight for me. But yeah, who knows? parasites. I don't know. That's, yeah, we don't, we don't know.
Yeah, I mean, and it's you know, a deeper area to study, and you mentioned the deep sea sharks, and it's one thing to study sharks in, you know, a meter of water. It's another thing in 400, 500, 800, 1,000 meters of water. You know, there's a lot more that goes into it. Limited time, very expensive equipment to be able to access that. So Jade, who is joining us from Australia, wants to know what you think the weirdest shark is.
Oh, okay. All right, the first two animals that jump to my mind are the goblin shark, that weird shark with the big nose that comes out. Again, a deep sea critter that we know almost nothing about. And that's just, yeah, that thing's just freaky. Like, what does the big thing do? I don't know. I have no idea. So that's weird. The other one is weird and cool, is the cookie cutter shark. I mean, there is no other shark out there like that. So this thing's about that big, and it's got these massive cookie cutter jaws that it uses to take chunks out of like swordfish, whales, nuclear submarines. And it's almost like it sets a trap, right? Because when predators are looking for it from above at night, it's got this dark band in amongst this field of bioluminescence, so it really stands out and sucks them in. And then, yeah, it's this, how did this animal evolve to have that mode of predation with these massive jaws? I mean, crazy, just weird, just super weird. So, yeah.
That goes back to, you know, when Dean said there's so much more than white sharks, and you know, people know white sharks and hammerheads and tiger sharks, and I just take away there's little guys, there's sharks that glow, weird and amazing camouflage, rare, and yeah, and just how diverse they are, the different adaptations they have. That is what's remarkable. And yes, they have some things in common, all sharks, but yeah, it's just when you start thinking about it, how diverse they are. And the species you highlighted, look at the patterns, the shape, the habitats. It's just, it's really, really remarkable. And yeah, like how, why the nose, why the jaw, why the, you know, it's just, yeah. But I think that makes it really exciting, and I hope that exciting for people, because it isn't obvious answers. It is, again, it's challenging and to explore these different species.
Yeah, I mean, you know, why the pelagic stingray? I still keep coming back to that. It makes no sense.
And it's back in with you. I'm gonna have to ask Duncan, my husband, because he filmed the stingray out in open water off Haiti, and I don't. They were like, "What are you doing here?" Like, you know, and 1,000 feet or 2,000 feet of water and a drop off, and stingray kind of cruise through. So, and yeah, you're going, wait a minute, are you lost? But, yeah. Okay. So you showed a couple. You talked about diving. Do you have a favorite? I guess these are kind of two questions that could go together. Campbell, a couple other people. A favorite dive, but with that, a favorite encounter with a shark?
Oh, a favorite dive. So my favorite dive is probably the first night dive I did off a place in the Coral Sea called Osprey Reef, which is super sharky. But amazingly, what happened was I was on the deco line. So that's the line coming off the back doing sort of 5 meter safety stop. And something, because it was a night, right? Something sort of squidded by in the beam, just on the corner of the beam of my torch. And I was like, what's that? So I just stuck my finger out. And this tiny pelagic octopus, which at that time hadn't been described yet, this little octopus, this big, just came and then sat on my finger like that. And I was just like, had the deco line wrapped around my arm with the torch. And this thing just stayed on my finger for the whole deco stop. And at the time, like I said, it was still an undescribed species. And that was just, I'll never forget that. That was mind blowing. In terms of shark encounters, honestly, I haven't, a lot of the work I do is from the surface because, you know, we're tagging. And I've been working in sharks for a long time and I've still never seen a hammerhead underwater. I've never seen a tiger shark underwater. I've tagged them all from the surface. Actually, yeah. Nurse sharks. which are useless animals. I was diving again in really murky water doing a reef survey, and I saw this big shadow off the side to me. And my dive buddy I knew was terrified of sharks, so I didn't say anything. So I got to the end of the transect line, stopped, and I'm turn off the camera and look up, and I just see my dive buddy looking at me, and her eyes are massive, and there's a stream of bubbles coming out of a regulator. She's freaking out. She's just doing this. And at the same time, I felt something grab my fin and pull me backwards and start pulling me down the reef. And I just thought, oh, it's been good. And I turned around, it's this nurse shark. Like, I thought it was a tiger shark when I saw this big shadow in the murk. I was like, oh, well, that's big. And then when something grabbed my leg, I was like, oh, it's a tiger shark. And yeah, it turned out to be a nurse shark. So yeah, that's certainly memorable. And he just wanted to play.
Yeah, well, we'll get you to Bimini at some point for hammering loads of nurse sharks. We have plenty of them. So, all right, and one last question. If there was one thing you wish that everybody knew about sharks, what would it be?
All right. They're linked, okay? The one thing I wish people knew is that there are so many types of them, so that when you hear people say, oh, you know, sharks, there's sharks everywhere, or, you know, sharks are all disappearing, like, we must save them. It's like, well, which sharks? Like, be specific. Do you really know how many different types of sharks there are out there? And then that plays into this whole thing about sharks being dangerous animals. Well, no, a cat shark. I mean, the only way for someone to die from cat sharks is for that cat shark to be frozen solid and then for them to be bludgeoned with it, right? Cat sharks are zero threat to people. In fact, most sharks are too small to physically harm humans. And I wish that just the general public understood that there are so many different types of sharks and rays out there, that just because you see and this has happened in my backyard here. Someone sees a baby shovel-nosed ray that big swimming in the water, and then the next day the newspaper's got like sharks plaguing the beach. It's a shovel-nosed ray. They're there all the time. Like, that would be it.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think it is. It is, you know, a shark isn't just a shark, it's a shark is a shark. And I think, you know, your talk in particular has really showed us that, just how diverse, and I'm really glad. I hope all the students, I love learning about new species. I love sharing that with students. We really try and get them excited about the little guys, the different guys, the rare guys, the deep sea guys. And so, yeah, I think, you know, all the information you shared. So thank you so much for all the wonderful questions and for all the guests that joined us. And thank you, Dr. Anderton, so much for the really fascinating information. And I hope people contact you, they explore the pages, definitely follow up, because it sounds like there's going to be some new information coming out about some of these species, which is really exciting. So thank you so much for your time. Thank you, everyone who joined us. Have a great night or morning, depending on where you are.
Yep, back to work now. All right. Thanks, Jillian.
Thank you.